Hello, dear audience. Last time we had a conversation on suffering. You are our guests at Feast of Healthy Thoughts, or we are your guest, talking about this important issue in our life. We're talking about suffering that humanity struggles against from the moment of creation, or if the unbelievers think of Big Bang, from that moment. We have been suffering. And the ultimate result of suffering is pain and death. So we suffer, we experience pain, and eventually we die. And we can say it's either relief from suffering or it perhaps is more suffering. But for some reason, we try to hide it. We try to cover it up. We try to use painkillers to pretend that it does not hurt. In my professional life, I come across to this very often when we get prescriptions at the pharmacy from the nursing homes and people are suffering there. And it is with trembling of heart that we send this pain medication, knowing that that person will suffer 1 minute less if we get there 1 minute earlier. But ultimately we are covering the suffering. That's my impression. So for this reason, Dr. Kyriaki and I are talking about suffering to get into the nuances, to find out how people cover their suffering, how they hide it, how they go to different routes and sometimes make their suffering even worse. And some people perhaps face the suffering head to head and come out on the other side, healthier, stronger, a different person perhaps. So let's talk about suffering from this perspective. Should we hide it? Should we expose it? Should we admit to ourselves that we are hurting? Or should we try to kill it as long as possible until we'll depart from this life? And we don't even know if that suffering will continue or it will stop with that.
Hi, Arkady. Hi, everyone. And so regarding suffering and the medical model that you were hinting about, that, you're kind of wondering, is taking pain medication to alleviate the pain from that the suffering gives, if that's always the right thing. And that's, I think, a great little springboard for us to jump into our little conversation. And this is a real conversation. Because sometimes the medication to cover the pain is a good thing. If it covers the pain so that somehow we are alleviated from experiencing pain and giving ourselves an opportunity to find healing, then that's good. If the pain medication is part of a bigger protocol and understanding that there's some kind of therapy going on to help heal whatever is underneath that causes the pain, that's great. And so it should be part of the regimen. If, however, and people do this, myself included, we seek medication or some kind of device to help numb the pain, just for the sake of numbing the pain, so that we can get through this, whatever this is. And there's a joke in AA calling this white knuckling. Sometimes we can white knuckle, and the source of the pain goes away after a time, and we got away with it. But other times we're masking the pain, and things get worse because the source of the pain is not addressed. And all of those possibilities can probably happen in every person's lifetime. And the better we are at discerning which is happening for us at a particular time while we are able, I think the better.
So do you think that there are ways that the humans, us, human beings, can go through the suffering that are identified ways? I'm trying to give a practical...
Well, I have an ex-friend. I'll talk about this ex-friend. Who shall remain nameless. As a small bunch of ex-friends that I have, but one particular ex-friend, I thought, by being transparent with my feelings about things, misunderstood a lot of my feelings. And so at one point, after a while, this ex-friend would say, why do you allow yourself, why do you indulge yourself to feel these issues? Why do you indulge yourself to name these pains? Why can't you just push them away? Why can't you? And I said, yes, there are times we have to push something out of our out of the present moment because we have some other task at hand, and if we have the ability to push something away for a bit, that's understandable. But she, over the course of time, did not understand or did not appreciate or misread my processing, in other words, my trying not to be in denial about what was giving me pain so that I can find a way through it and get to the other side as something undesirable or bad or unhealthy or even psychologically unstable. Now, the good thing is, I do this for a living and my day job is a psychologist, so she did not want to hear my side of things. It was a sad indicator to me that of how she processes things, that she just pushed things aside. And it's kind of like sweeping dirt under the rug. And the rug gets taller and taller and taller and taller. And after a while, you can't see the sun. And you think the darkness is how it's supposed to be because of this big wall here. But you don't realize that the wall was created by you, or me, by my keeping sweeping things under the rug. And so that's a danger all of us can fall into, not just my ex-friend, but I can do that still. And a gentle, daily, I think, self-examination is needed for us to say, you know, how am I doing? How am I engaging other people? How am I living up to what I think I am called to do for today in the presence of God and one another? And what's blocking me? And sometimes if it's a source of pain, it's important to come clean with that in the presence of God.
Are we talking here about confession type of naming the pain?
Sometimes, sure. So first, confession with our own selves in the presence of God. There's an ancient Christian custom that many people still follow, that at the end of their day, during their evening prayers, so those of us that have fallen off the wagon of having evening prayers, we should think about reestablishing some kind of gentle rule that works for us, if that works for us as Christians. But as part of that, to take a moment of inventory, self-inventory, from the best of my ability, how well did I do today in my relationships and my responsibilities and opportunities that presented themselves today. And so first confession with ourselves in the presence of God, and then to take that to one other person. And then, perhaps if we are Christians, to talk about this with wise people within the life of the church, and at the same time, the sacrament of confession for those of us especially who enjoy that as part of our tradition. It would be a tremendous benefit to realign ourselves with spiritual direction.
Sometimes people think of confession in a legalistic way, where I told you what I did, and now I'm free from the consequences. But can we say that part of the confession is to relieve the suffering that comes with the sin or with the misconduct or misdoing?
Well, the suffering if we have a conscience that we're kind of insecure, how am I doing in responding to this issue that's causing me pain, or this issue is causing me pain and confusion because I don't know the right way to go and it's messy, and if other people are involved, when other people are involved in our issues, it's always messy because we people tend to make things messy with each other. And so talking about this with someone wiser that we respect, especially in the Eastern Church, we have the custom of spiritual direction, where it's not just confessing our sins where we do the laundry list, like you said, but it's how am I conducting my life that can keep me aligned with God's purpose for me for today as best as I know how. And so we can talk in this way with brothers and sisters in the church also who have a measure of wisdom. And so I don't want to say this just should be reserved for your spiritual father, your priest, or your spiritual mother, if that's the relationship that's been blessed to have in your life. But let's say a little team of people, especially in this society. I think we need a team of friends and who are nutritious for us spiritually. And a spiritual director, spiritual father, spiritual mother, so that we can feel that our burden is shared, that we try to, in a sense, realign our intentions with the love and life of God in a messy situation. It's a good thing God knows us from the inside out, so that even if I make mistakes, when I make mistakes, when I blow it, that when I fall, and in fact, I was preparing for a series of interviews that kind of happened. But one of the questions I was told to prepare for is, in my rehearsal with someone, talk about your failures. What kind of failures have you had? And the answer I blurted out was, I fail every day. Oh, that's not good enough. You've got to give examples. I said, no, you don't understand. I fail every day, and with God's help, I fail falling face forward. So every time I fail, I fall face flat on the ground, but somehow in a direction leading that God wants. I pick myself back up, and
you're in
I'm in a different place.
Right. One step closer.
One step closer someplace, and then I fail again, and I ask you, oh dear God, please make sure I fall the right way. And that's how I've been growing pretty much all of my life, falling forward in the right direction with God's help.
I remember when I was in the school, we would run and then jump. So if we had to fall, it was suggested to fall forward, because if you fell backwards, your hands marked where you landed, not your feet.
Right. Very good. And that's also good for our own spiritual and psychological lives. Try to fall forward. Try to learn something out of it as you fall on your face.
It's interesting that we always concentrate on the victim when we talk about suffering. But in some circumstances, the oppressor may be suffering also. Because the victim at least has a consolation that his or she's a victim. You can say, well, people are torturing me, so there's nothing I can do about it. I can escape. But the person who conducts the torture may be suffering inside from something that we don't even know. Maybe he or she doesn't even realize. But there is suffering in that end, I think, bigger than on the victim's side. Do we know anything about that kind of suffering?
Everybody loses. When the oppressor, so to speak, is oppressing their victim, that's an extreme version of the sin of familiarity. We've talked about the sin of familiarity before, where someone is defined. There's a predefinition of the other person. And so if I define another person, let's say I'm the superior person, I'm defining you as inferior, deserving punishment, or deserving to be treated in a certain way. I'm holding you hostage to my definition of who you are. But when I do that, I'm holding you hostage, but I'm also holding me hostage. I don't realize I'm doing that. I'm staying in that hostage to that master-slave, let's say, relationship, which is both dehumanizing, which is both robbing each of us the opportunity of authentic relationship. I saw this great couple, and both in their own way had to acknowledge in the marriage counseling their own power in the relationship. On the surface, it looked like the husband had more power on the surface. And in some ways, he does. But what came during the session is that each person wielded a lot of power in different ways. And so while the husband had one kind of power, the wife had her kind of power, which is very intelligent. They were both bright, but she was particularly swift in being articulate to some of the things that she noticed going on, which were correct. But in her being articulate with certain things going on, she also was missing on a few that would have helped the relationship. So we started talking about how it was interesting. Yes, at times it looked like the husband had more power, but she was also wielding her own power that was hurting him. And when both were operating out of the power blindly and deadening their relationship to each other. And so, today was a successful day, I think, with them, because they both saw a little bit in something that they worked together, which was one of their children, who's a miracle child, who's growing in ways that truly astounded me. And I said, the two of you didn't mess that up. The two of you did not mess this young person up. And this young person, their child, is extraordinary, extraordinary. And I say that having been around. And so I said, and yes, the child makes their own choices. And I don't even say the gender of the child, because it's just to save anonymity of these real people I'm seeing. And that there are other people who might sound like this, which is not impossible because there are a number of families having similar issues. And so that they left with a kind of, oh, we tried to mess it up, but it didn't get messed up. And for them to start examining the spiritual resources that they brought into the marriage, which they hadn't until this time, that may be a neglected resource. And so there's a tiny bit of hope today, this afternoon, than there was this morning for this relationship. So I thank God for that.
Mm-hmm. How about subconscious or unconscious cause of suffering? People talk about the growth of humanity on the planet. It has doubled or tripled since 1950s. There's less space, there are less resources, and ultimately that causes suffering. In other words, what I'm getting to is just my existence is a cause of suffering for someone else because I'm taking space. Is that, from the spiritual or theological perspective, considered the result of the sin, or how can we look at it?
It's a contemporary formulation of an issue that we would have to break down to understand it, to prioritize it, because there's so many issues there. But as we said in the previous episode, we're all connected. We're all deeply connected. And there's a Buddhist expression that I like a lot that says that the fluttering of a butterfly on the other side of the world has reverberations here. So if the fluttering of the wings of a butterfly have reverberation here where we are, what about each and every human person? And so it's important to, I think, acknowledge how we're connected even when we live alone in our own little place. My husband and I were last month in Thessaloniki, Greece, and we were participating at a conference and had the honor of seeing people and working with people that we hadn't seen in a long time. And one of the people that we were able to spend a little bit of time with was one of my classmates from the School of Theology, the University of Thessaloniki in Greece, who now is an associate professor of church history and historical theology at the School of Theology at the University of Thessaloniki. And we had dinner together, and she said, I've been teaching and doing a few publishings, but not as much as I'd like because I've been raising, she's a single mom, I've been raising my son, but now that my son is older, I've started to write a book that will be rather, I'm hoping, a contribution to the church. The topic is, what did the middle and working class people in earlier centuries do during times of iconoclasm? Mm-hmm. Because when we read church history, iconoclasm is the issue that the church during the Middle Ages fought about. Do icons and religious statues, are they to be used within the life of the church, or are they idols? And so this was an issue that went on for decades and centuries, and so that was resolved in the 9th century. And so she has been looking for information. How did this controversy, since it went on for lifetimes, that within families some people were saying yes, others were saying no. And so there was strife in families, there was suffering in families over religious issues, meaning, how do you love Christ? Can Christ be depicted in an icon, yes or no? And there were generations of people who excommunicated the other over this. And so one of the issues that she's been able to get some research on, that I can't wait for her to really get into this and publicize this, is that she found letters of people writing to their bishop. What do I do? My grandparents passed away, and they were on the other side. They were on the iconoclast side. But they were Christians. I know they loved the Lord, and we knew this in seminary, but to say this really affected families. There was suffering in families over these issues. So it wasn't even some of the suffering we watch on TV. It was suffering in excommunication within families. And the bishop wrote, at least in the letter that she was talking about over dinner, he said, your grandparents' anniversary is coming up. Trisayun prayers, the prayers of memorial for those who have passed on, they could not be said because they were on the wrong side of the street regarding their stance on icons. And so, but the grandchildren are saying, if I'm wrong, it's the children, but let's say the grandchildren are saying, they were good Christians, they believed in the Lord, they were just on the wrong side. And the iconophile, the bishop, who was the ruling bishop at the time, said, you can say these prayers at home, they have impact. You can say the same prayers at home. You're a baptized Christian. The Lord hears your prayers. And I would go one step further, my child, go and do good and alleviate the suffering of someone else. this has caused suffering in your family, go out and look to do good outside of you through almsgiving or trying to help someone actively and personally. And I'm thinking, wow. So what would that be like for us to go look for people, you know, to do that random act of kindness? And maybe not just a random act, but acts of kindness that otherwise would not have happened. How would that influence, how would that reverberate outside of that event? And also, whatever we're suffering through, how does that change? I don't know, because it depends on the person and the situation. But it's defiant to evil, to do good instead of evil.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned about the Buddhism. Buddhism is the religion of alleviating. The ultimate goal is to overcome the suffering. In the Christian world, it's kind of the opposite. Christ was the long-suffering servant, and he did not stop from suffering himself. Could we say a few words about this? We have a few examples in the New Testament where Christ cries over a simple thing for him, I guess.
Well,
over death.
The balance, we have to remember that's right. Jesus wept. Yes. Two-word sentence over Lazarus. And just to go there, I think the tears were less for losing his friend and more, although I'm sure he probably felt that in a human manner because he was also human. But more, he wept for the sins of the generation that brought the world to this state. And so I think there's like a layer that goes even deeper to that understanding. We tend to skip over the biblical references that Jesus was a source of scandal also, that he ate with sinners and whoremongers, and he ate with gluttons and drunkards. He must have laughed a lot while he was on earth. He must have seen the humor and enjoyed whatever happens at the table of common people who are not too different from us, who are in pain, who have issues, who get to have the rabbi sit with them at the table and let their hair down, so to speak. And so I think we have to remember that the Lord also laughed. I would believe that he laughed a lot. Why? Because the suffering was so exquisite. He had to enjoy the life that he was given. We don't know how he spent most of his childhood, his first 30 years. That was private. I'm sure he had a lot of wonderful experiences that made that made his life on the human side, I won't say delicious. I'm sure he enjoyed the roses. I'm sure he enjoyed the lilies of the field. I'm sure he watched the sparrows and wondered, got to admire his creation as a member of the creation.
From this side.
Yeah, from this side. I imagine that he appreciated his own creation from a different way, as he should. Mm-hmm. As he should. So that's the first thing I want to remind us, that suffering happens, that we're supposed to pick up our cross, not somebody else's cross. And so while we will hang eventually on our own cross, if it's the right cross, and we carry it well, there will also be joys and opportunities and gifts to do good and hopefully share with others for whatever time of that we've been given, and opportunities to do good that we've been given, as well as carry our cross and eventually end up there. And so I wanted to add that because we're talking about suffering, and it's easy because some suffering and trauma are interconnected, that when we get traumatized, it's easy to get hypersensitive to trauma and suffering. And so then it becomes kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it tends to make us go in the direction of suffering even when it might not be called for. And so as an Orthodox, we will be accused of, oh, you're Orthodox, and now you're into suffering. Yep. And I would talk to other Orthodox and say, okay, that's absolutely true. And at the same time, within that, how do we rejoice? This is a day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And to trust in that reality also. And that will color things, I think.
So I've also heard that many psychologists or philosophers will accuse Christianity as having no joy in it, because some of our ancient hymns sound sad, maybe we have sad faces, we have icons that don't have emotions on them, but we also know about inner joy of Christian life. There is different quality of joy that Christians experience, perhaps when they reach theosis, or even small joys when they experience God's presence. When we talk about Christ laughing, having a joyful day, looking at the creation, what kind of joys are we talking about? Because we are going to talk about joy eventually, because Christianity is about joy, I think. Can we qualitate, say this is a different kind of joy than this, and this is the Christian joy, not this?
Joy and happiness, and happiness is a little bit more complicated. So if I say joy, I want you and the audience to know I include happiness under that term. In the United States, happiness is also a political term, and the pursuit of happiness, for example. And there's a nuance in the political sense of the pursuit of happiness that's very individualistic, that's based in rights, and I'm not saying that's unimportant, that's very important. But the angle of it is the focus of it is incomplete, I would say, as an Orthodox Christian. That authentic happiness, that authentic joy is in the presence of God and one another in all creation. And so, but joy comes out of relationship. Mm-hmm. And so while we might experience joy at a promotion, at something new coming, a new baby, a new home, even a new gift, a new car, there might be a kind of joy that comes with that, a kind of joy. It's not the same joy as entering into paradise, but there's some kind of, but it's not disconnected if we see it as a gift of God. And so, why? Because we bless cars. If we bless cars and bikes and items and churches and homes and our new bed and the wedding ring and the engagement rings, we bless everything. Why? Because it's all a gift from God. And so that joy is a response to the gift that's been given to us by the loving God himself. And so I'll tell you something, and I'm not sure if I should say who the person was, but I was speaking with someone not too long ago, and she came up to me and she said, I just had the weirdest dream this morning right before I woke up, my first appointment actually. And I said, okay, what's up? A lot of people come to me with their dreams, and she said, I dreamt that I was kidnapped and taken to heaven, kicking and screaming, that Jesus picked me up, laughing at me, and threw me into heaven, even though I was complaining and mitching and boning the whole way. And I said, oh, I like that dream. And I said, what was that like? And she said, I can't tell you how surprised by joy. I felt I was tackled by joy, that despite my best efforts to mess things up, the Lord came and picked me up and bodily threw me into heaven. And I thought, I'm okay with that. Make yourself amenable to that, and and keep it up. So joy is always relational.
You spoke about consumeristic, I think, happiness. I have experienced all of it, and I'm sure that all our audience have experienced receiving or buying or getting something that makes them happy. And I think sometimes when we have or know only that kind of happiness, the question becomes even more severe. Why can't I be happy? Why do I have to suffer? And what I have experienced is, perhaps in a result of suffering, I have searched for happiness in those kind of ways. And what I've realized is that I will receive something, or I'll buy something most of the time. It will make me extremely happy. And then shortly after that, I will have complete, unknowable, I don't know where the source is, a pain, internal pain, not like physical pain, but sorrow. To the point where I started seeing patterns, that when I was buying something and feeling the first glimpses of happiness, I immediately knew that the pain is coming next. And I kind of stopped making myself happy that way as much as possible, because I knew that that follows with the pain.
So what you're talking about is a kind of happiness, a kind of joy, a kind of gratification that comes from a material thing.
Yes.
And as a material thing, as an end, I will be happy if I get these shoes. I will be happy if I get this coat. My definition of happiness or joy is a result around that thing, which in the long run is an idolatry. We make that thing more important than it is. It's a gift, but it's not an end in itself. And so a thing that makes us happy. And so it might give us enjoyment, but it cannot make us happy. And so that we live in a culture that promotes that. You buy this, you'll become happy. It's buying the lie, or as I tell people, drinking the Kool-Aid. You know, it's a kind of cultish kind of thing, you know, which is coming from the secular world. But you're also pointing to the issue between joy and being high. And high is, again, a result of our deliberately chasing satisfaction away from God. It's all about us. But I want to say about a third thing, just to sort of as a balance in between joy and suffering. That when we suffer, I do think when we suffer well, when it's in that right balance, that we're not looking for extra suffering, but that we're suffering well with what's on our plate, that when we do suffer well, the capacity to feel joy somehow grows in us, and in ways that we can't explain. But when we are in denial of this, then there's also reciprocal loss of opportunity for growing in joy that could have opened up for us. One way to sort of make the way for that is to remember, and this is really a Christian principle, but I'm going to bring the serenity prayer, that what's called the serenity prayer, that is used in the 12-step world, that says, God or Lord, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That points to a discipline of making space in our own selves, of saying what I can't do, which is what only God can do, and what I am able to do, and to surrender with serenity that what I can't do. The more we can surrender that we truly cannot do, which might mean sometimes to end the suffering, which might mean sometimes I can't end the pain, I can't make myself get better, or bring back my loved one who's gone now. No matter what I do with my loved one is not coming back. My ex-friend, gone. To accept the things I cannot change. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. Another word for serenity is peace. And so by letting go and letting God, so to speak, which is again made popular by the 12-step world, but it's a beautiful discipline to cultivate as Christians, gives us space to be humble, right-sized, pliable, even vulnerable to a greater extent, to live our lives going forward in a way that will bear fruit and take us places we haven't been as we're getting better, or as we're carrying our cross.
I mentioned about the icons having no emotions. Do you think that ultimate happiness is in that middle line where there is no swing from happiness to suffering, from suffering to happiness, and we never stop in the middle? Is that middle?
That's a beautiful connection you're making, is the peace of God. That's what those prayers point toward. And when we see the icons, the majority of Orthodox icons that you will see in a church or even in people's homes, they look unemotional. But what we affirm is they are in the presence of the loving God. They are experiencing the peace and love of God. And so they are connected to God as they are connecting to us at the same time. And so while it looks unemotional from a human attachment perspective, you know, we're attached to all these extremes in our everyday life, they are connected to authentic reality. And what's that? Abiding in the love of the living thrice holy God and all of the angels and saints in heaven. And so they are grounded in serenity. They are grounded in peace. They are grounded in absolute love. And so there's a kind of quiet presence and awareness and openness, receptivity to God, with whom they are standing, which is what the icon stands for. Oftentimes there's gold light in the back. That's reminding the person in front of the icon they're in paradise in the presence of God, in the light of God, and connecting with us, inviting us into that presence.
Speaking about the icons, I also remembered when I was growing up, I came across too many flyers spread by so-called Christians, mostly Jehovah's Witnesses, and I saw a lot of cheesy happiness on those pictures. And even non-religious person who doesn't have the idea of the peace of God or calmness or serenity could see the cheesiness of that this is not real. Yes, we laugh, we are happy, but those images of super happiness that is probably our expectation or their expectation in the end result of their beliefs are not realistic or unbalanced. That came also to my mind. I constantly try to ask this question. Is from very early time in the seminary, my attention was drawn to the suffering of the Jews in the desert. And at one point, perhaps I discovered the wheel, but I discovered for myself that the journey in the desert could have been days. Right. From one place to another does not take 40 years. And these poor people were in the desert 40 years. And some explanations and some of my understanding was that they needed to be in the desert. What do you think of that from the perspective of suffering, that we come out into a promised land like the Jews when we suffer, so that the audience do not, hearing this, perhaps having some kind of source of suffering, will know there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Like I have mentioned in the past episodes that Armenians do not say good night, they say good morning when they leave somebody's house or they depart from each other at night. So they refer to the morning that will come, not the morning that passed. And they don't talk about the night because the night can be horrible. Suffering exists, and this example of the Jews' exodus from Egypt, from slavery, that we connect to the sin also, was kind of a suffering.
It was a journey. The journey could have been just a few days, but instead the journey took them 40 years, so that a new generation would enter the promised land. And they lost a lot of baggage along the way. Even as God was leading them around and around in circles, they were changing from the inside out through that journey. And it was not easy. And so the journey of our own lives, one of the Christian ancient symbols for the church is the ark, the boat. And that we are all on a journey as Christians together on the boat, leading us to the kingdom of God. And by extension, all of us have our own little boats within the boat. That also, we have the journey of our own life. We are on a pilgrimage. We can use that metaphor also, that we're journeying on a boat or we are walking a path. And sometimes the path is easy. Sometimes we are robbed along the path or mugged. Sometimes there are roses along the path. Sometimes it's just rock and we have to walk uphill in the dark. And it's unpredictable how every person's path will go, except that we have one. If we walk it well, if we journey honestly, we will be different by the time we get to the end. Either we will be older, will it be a lot older, a little older? That's not for me to say, for myself, never mind anyone else. But will we be better? Will we be changed in a way that reflects who we really are, that God uses time and the material, even our own fallenness. God's not stupid. Even our own fallenness he can use for his glory. And so that's a relief for me, that even when I mess up, I can keep falling forward. If I keep falling forward, I wind up going a lot of cool places I never expected before, just falling in the right direction. even though I don't, the intention to fall in the right direction oftentimes is all I need. It's just, Lord, I'm trying to, the desire to please you is pleasing to God. To say to God, I want to please you. Even if we mess up, it pleases God.
We talked about suffering. Maybe there is imbalance in the life around us. We know the examples of Mother Teresa. I have come across of explanations of suffering, reading Chrysostom and Basil the Great. They explain horrible suffering around their environment, in the society where they live.
St. John Chrysostom died in exile because he spoke up regarding injustice of the powers that be. St. Basil the Great, whom we see in icons with long white hair, was only 49 when he died. And he died of exhaustion, trying to help the people of his city recover from the earthquakes that were taking place. And so that says something to us about picking up our own cross and following God, and authentic suffering, and also to live our lives.
Thank you again, Presbytera, and perhaps the example of Basil the Great will be the leading light for us to eliminate suffering in our lives and in the lives of others like he did. Thank you again, dear audience. This was a wonderful conversation, and we'll continue. We'll eventually talk about happiness, joy, because Christianity is all about joy. Our fathers, our mothers, the holy people, in the midst of suffering, experienced the joy of God. Thank you, and see you next time.